We're working on making a custom underseat subwoofer enclosure for 3 13-inch subwoofers. In this video, I'm going to show you several handheld router techniques that can allow you to make your next project far more interesting. No CNC machine here, just a few different router bits and a plan. Hey, what's going on, guys? I'm Mark. Welcome to CarAudioFabrication. Here on this channel, together we learn how to master car audio and how to design, build, and install our dream car audio system. Let's get on into it. All right, guys, so where we left off in the last video is we had built our custom enclosure, as you guys can see right here. We've got the bracing on the inside. We did those rounded corners, the angled top. Now we need to affix the top of the enclosure. Just like all of our other joints so far, we're going to apply wood glue, and we want to make sure that we have 100% coverage, so we're going to use a silicone brush in order to spread this all out, adding more glue if needed. A little something like this here looks good, so now I can apply the top. Carefully line up the back and the sides as close as I can. And if you guys didn't see the previous video, this is intentionally oversized just slightly. That way we can trim it perfectly flush in a minute here. Add a couple of brad nails just to secure this in place for the time being, and now I'm going to apply a bunch of clamps. I get this question quite frequently, so a quick side note, you want to remember that the wood glue is what adds the strength to the joint between the two different pieces of material, and your brad nails are mainly just there to hold the pieces of material tight together while that wood glue dries. So like I said, I shot a bunch of brad nails while the clamps were on, and now I can remove those clamps and allow the wood glue to keep drying, but I do want to also just add a bead of wood glue around all of these mating surfaces. In this case, not so much to add strength to the joint, but more so just to make sure that it's completely sealed. Simple enough, we'll just run a bead like this, and then we will come back on each one and just clean it up with our finger. Now, if each of your cuts aren't perfectly square, you may want to use a different type of sealant in order to better bridge the larger gaps. But in my case here, I like using the wood glue because it dries relatively clear, it dries relatively quickly, and if we did happen to have any gaps between the pieces that didn't have wood glue, it's going to seep in and give us more of that joint. Now the enclosure is currently obviously upside down, and the next step I want to do is I want to use my router to remove some of this excess material, but you can still see that we have some glue that's drying here. So we're going to take a quick lunch break in order to let this dry. Let's take a quick second to talk about our show sponsor for this episode, KnuKonceptz. To install an amplifier into a vehicle, you're of course going to need an amplifier wiring kit, and one of my favorites is the Colossus Flex Kits. These come in several different options already, but better yet, KnuKonceptz is now allowing more flexibility for options by allowing you to choose the wire color in the kit and also allowing an option to upgrade your kit to a higher quality RCA cable. They also have tons of different individual items too for wiring your next car audio build. So be sure to check them out at the link down in the video description. We are now back at it. You can see that the wood glue is completely dry, and now we need to trim this top piece of the subwoofer enclosure, and we're going to do so on the router. Now here at the router, I have a piece of 3/4 inch thick material, which is the same thickness as the top of the enclosure, and I'm using it to adjust my bit height out of the table. We want that bottom bearing to be just over the top surface of this. Now the router bit that we're using is a 1/4 inch spiral flush trim bit. This particular one is a quad bearing bit. For this application, we don't necessarily need to use that quad bearing. I'm just using this because I know this is a nice brand new fresh bit. Now the reason I've loaded onto my center router is I want to make sure that I have plenty of surface area to work with. I've lowered the other two bits because this enclosure is big. I need to have a lot of space. I know that once I pick up the enclosure, I want to start on this corner here, so I'm going to turn on the dust collection, fire up the router, start on this corner, and work through the cut. Now that we've made this cutting pass, you can see how it makes that top panel perfectly conform to our complex shape that we have going around the edge of the enclosure. Now I flipped the subwoofer enclosure back over, and if you guys watched during the assembly process video, I mentioned that a lot of times I like to intentionally make some of these pieces just ever so slightly longer than what they need to be. An example of that being this back piece here. It's ever so slightly longer, and that's intentional because I know that I can clean this up on a router as well. You could of course also sand so that this surface ends up mating with this surface, but the router just does it so much more quickly. So I buzzed that off quickly on the router. Now we have a nice, completely smooth surface that will require minimal sanding just to kind of get rid of some of these machine marks. In just a second here, we're going to turn our attention to doing some of the detail work that's going to be on the side and on the front of the enclosure, but I do know that I want to soften up this top edge here. I want to add a roundover to that. So before I attach any of these pieces that could potentially get in the way of the router process, they shouldn't because I don't plan on doing anything to the top, and we're going to flip it on the top, but regardless, I just want to knock out this step anyhow. I really want the top of the enclosure to look nice and smooth, so we're going to use a big roundover bit. This is a 1/2 inch roundover right here, 1/2 inch shank. It's got that bearing on top that's going to ride against the surface and cut that profile down below. I figured I'd throw in this little helpful tidbit of information just in case you are new to using the router. I like to use a drill with one of these keys here rather than using the hand key. This just makes things a little bit more smooth and efficient for me. But what's extremely important is you want to make sure that you have the clutch set to a low setting. That way it's going to slip if it encounters any resistance, because we definitely don't want to strip out the gears in our router lift. Doing these router bit changes does take a little bit of time, so you can see the benefit of having multiple of them. I typically leave a flush trim bit always loaded in one, and usually a roundover is another common bit to have loaded up. So more routers, less bit changes. I'm gonna get this close here and then dial things in the rest of the way with a hand crank. You can see that I have a scrap piece of material. I'm just making sure that that's going to slide up over the edge of the radius of the roundover, so we can lock this in place and make our cutting pass. After that cutting pass is complete, you can see we have this really nice round profile on the top of the enclosure. And even though things get a little bit weird with this angle on the back when you're resting on this face, it's a big enough roundover that it still makes contact with this back edge. So after doing a little bit of testing, I decided I liked that look, and I continued the roundover along the back panel of the enclosure as well. Now we need to discuss what details we want to add, and I just did a little rough sketch here. What I'm going for here is this kind of mimics the look of the floor mats in the rear of the vehicle. It has this kind of elongated oval type design with some different angles. And then in this vehicle, this is what I typically like to do, something like this on the side of the enclosure. I did something like this on a previous project, but that mimics the look of this side trim here. I've obviously popped this out of the vehicle so that we could carefully measure it. But what I'll probably be doing based on the size of this here is I'll probably incorporate 3 of these angled fingers, if you will, on the side of the enclosure, along with a body line that kind of flows from here down to here. Doing these steps is just going to help tie the enclosure to the look of the vehicle, making it look more like it belongs and like it was made for that vehicle. Let's start with making these fingers here. I start with making some pieces that are the width and length of each of the fingers, and then on the router, I cut off that corner at the correct angle to make it match. Next, I want to make sure that I incorporate some of these 45-degree chamfers that are part of this design. So I'm going to have a sacrificial piece of wood material between 2 of the different fingers because I need to machine a left and right version, and that allows me to maximize the angle of cut on the router when cutting with a chamfer bit. So here's how those look after going through this process. You can see these match the size and look that we are going for here, and I have 6 of them total. I'm going to do 3 on each side of the enclosure, and we need them, of course, to be opposite of each other, which is the advantage of using that sandwich system for making these. You're going to have a left and right. Now, although it would probably look cool enough to just add these to the side of the enclosure, I want to add a little bit more shape and dimension, so I'm going to make this kind of rounded corner piece with this angled front first. In this case, I'm going to start with basically making a rectangle. I'm going to measure a height and a depth that I would like to use. I cut that on the table saw, and then over on the router, I'm again going to add an angle, and in this case, I'm going to smooth out that top corner by using a circle template. So let's see how this plate now looks on the side of the enclosure. Check that out. You can see that just adding this one little bit of geometry really makes the enclosure look more complex and unique. Now there is something that I need to take care of here, and that's that I need to add this little notched corner to this piece. This notched corner gives me some clearance in the vehicle over part of the floor mat, and I want to make sure that that is machined perfectly matching into this piece. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to permanently attach these on each side of the enclosure, and I'm going to flush trim that profile before I add these on. The reason I want to do it before is because I need this surface to actually sit against the router table, and I don't want to have these in the way. Although it would probably be okay, I could just extend the router bit more out of the table. I think it's just going to be a better idea to hold off on mounting these until that profile is cut. So we've got our side piece now matched up to that rear notch profile, and now we can add these little bits of detail here. You can see that off camera I've already measured out the locations of these. I want to make sure that I have even spacing, and I of course also wanted to get a feel for how it was going to look in regards to the spacing here and here. But I like how this looks now where I have it laid out, so I'm just going to use some of that CA glue, which is super glue again, to quickly and permanently locate these in place. So I'd love to hear what you guys think of this so far. To me, this is super cool. You can add just a little bit of geometry. These are very simple shapes along with some profiling with those router bits, and we really add a ton of detail to that side. And not only that, don't forget that it's going to help match the look of the vehicle. Now we're going to turn our attention to the front of the enclosure, and here is what I have so far. I spent some time cutting this piece of material down to the overall dimensions that I would like to use for the shape, and then also sketching on here the profile that I would like to make. Again, the goal here is to match some of the shape and design on the floor mats in the vehicle, and my plan here is to take this piece of wood, I'm going to cut these cuts and make this overall shape first. I'm then going to make a secondary piece, that way we can use it as a sacrificial piece so that I can maximize the chamfer angle on this part here. But I'm also going to incorporate a router groove on the front here to add some more detail and dimension. And we're going to be doing some router grooves into the box itself. Stay with me on this. I think it's going to be super cool. First, I need to do the rough cutting. I'm going to cut away that extra material, and then I'm going to use templates along with template tape and a flush trim bit on the router to completely make this shape using a variety of different straight templates and some circle templates to add some rounded corners. So now that we've completed all of those router steps, here is our shape. Now I just want to mention something really quick, because every time I use a bunch of router templates to make a shape, to make some geometry on an enclosure or for a project, the comment always comes up, Mark, why don't you just use a CNC machine? You need a CNC. My friends, I own a CNC machine. I've actually used it before on other projects here on the channel that are heavily CAD driven, where we design those initial shapes on the computer and then export them. We might as well use a CNC machine. My point here of using the router templates to make these shapes is to demonstrate to you guys that there's different ways to do this. You don't necessarily have to have an expensive CNC machine in order to be able to build like we're showing here in the video. So I hope that some of you guys out there that don't own a CNC machine find value in that. But here you can see this is where we're going to be adding this to the front of the enclosure. And now that I've made this shape, I'm looking at this and I feel like 1/2" material, which was what I've used so far to make this piece, is just going to be too thick. I did use 1/4" here and 1/4" here. That's obviously a 1/2" overall. I'm just thinking it's going to look too bulky on the front of the enclosure to go with that thickness. So I'm going to copy this instead to a piece of 1/4". And you know what? That's something to consider anyhow. If we were building a lot of this same enclosure where we wanted to use this shape over and over, there's nothing that says that we have to remake this shape every time. We could easily use it as a masterpiece and copy it in the future for the piece that's actually going to be attached to the enclosure. So I've now copied that profile to a piece of 1/4" material, and I'm going to keep these two pieces attached to each other because I want to make this a sacrificial piece, the 1/2" piece. That way I can maximize my chamfer on that 1/4" piece. But before we do that, I want to add some detail on top here, and I'm going to basically add some grooves, 3 different grooves of different lengths. So the one in the middle is going to be long. and then the two on the top and bottom are going to be a little bit shorter. And I'm going to be using these guides from Mobile Solutions along with a bull nose bit in the router. And you can see I've got one of these guide bushings from the template guide system. That guide will basically run in this groove here once I template tape this in position. Now I do have some prep work I need to do. I want to make sure that I transfer the center lines in this location and in this location. That will allow me to line up the index marks on these templates. And the other thing that I'll need to do is I'll want to add some stop blocks. That's because I don't want to use the full length of this rail necessarily, so I'm going to measure out and template tape this in position. That way the router will stop at a certain point on each end when we reach it. The reason that I'm doing all of this prior to adding the chamfer to this piece is just so I have enough surface for the template tape to stick to. And I'm also going to be template taping this onto the table temporarily just to keep everything mounted in position while I do this hand router task. So here it is, guys, the piece just temporarily sitting on top of the enclosure. And you can see how we've maximized, again, that chamfer cut there. I like how this is looking, but we do want to add a little bit more detail. So we're going to take this out of the way for the time being, and we're going to go back to using our original piece here. And notice that I've put an arrow on each piece, that way we are consistent. What I want to do here is again use the guide bushing, but this time I'm going to use it up against the edge of this shape that we made here, and that should leave us two grooves that follow the outside shape of this. Now again, I'm going to be using stop blocks because I don't want to go around this part here. I just want it to kind of end roughly in this location. So I'm going to put some stop blocks in the way that the router will bump up against so that I know that I stop in a consistent area. I'll measure those out. And the reason I have this on the floor leaned up against the support beam here is I don't want the enclosure to fall over while I'm doing this. So I've got my guide shape in place along with the stop blocks. These are template taped temporarily in position. And something else I like to do is on the base of the router, I like to temporarily secure a scrap piece of wood that is the same thickness as this piece. And this helps avoid having the router tip at all off of this piece. It just ensures that our machined groove is perfect. And I also like to just go through a dry run without the router attached, just to make sure that there's not going to be anything getting in the way or any sort of clearance issues. I'm happy with this, so I'm going to make my cutting pass. So here is what those grooves look like now that they are added along with this piece temporarily in position. And what I've noticed here is I kind of don't like how small this surface is right here. I kind of want it to be a little bit wider on that, which means I would need to shrink this shape down slightly. No worries, we can do that easily and still make use of this piece. We don't have to start all over. Let me show you guys how we do that. I've very carefully reattached our final piece to our template piece using template tape. And here at the router, I have a rabbiting bit. Now this cuts into the material by 1/8 of an inch. So that cutting flute is 1/8 inch away from this bearing. So what that's going to do is create a 1/8 inch step into my piece. And if I go all the way around the outside of the piece, it's going to shrink it by 1/8 of an inch on each side, or 1/4 inch overall. After doing that cutting pass, I can flip the pieces over and ride against that new groove to remove the excess material with a flush trim bit. Then, much like we did before, we want to maximize that 45-degree chamfer and make that cutting pass. After we've done that resize, you can see how that part of the profile right there is now more pronounced. I really like the way that that looks a lot better. All that's left to do now is permanently attach this piece to the front of the enclosure, and in this case I'm going to use wood glue just because of the size of this shape. I don't want to risk having CA glue set up too quickly and lock that piece in place where I don't want it. So after spreading out tons of wood glue, I'm going to pin nail this in position. With all of this detail work now complete, we can move on to the finishing stages of our enclosure. If you're new here, I'd love to have you as a subscriber, and don't forget next time that you need an amplifier rack for a car audio build, be sure to check out our show sponsor, KnuKonceptz, at the link down in the video description. A big thanks to them, along with Jerry and the rest of the Patreon membership team, and a big thanks to you guys for tuning in and watching.